Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for all those words of introduction, and a pleasure for me to have a chance to share with you some insights from work that we're involved in at RoRI, the Research on Research Institute, but also to hear and learn more about the current state of debates about assessment here in Spain, which, like most systems, continues to grapple with these dilemmas in various ways. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes or so and just try and do two things, really. Set the scene for where debates about research assessment and evaluation have got to right now, where they're at, and then to offer sort of 5 thoughts, really, for priorities, challenges for us as we try and take these debates forward, reflecting particularly on the potential contribution of newer approaches using AI and other techniques. So just to set the scene and start, I mean, we've seen a huge amount of discussion and activity and a lot of grassroots, bottom-up engagement from across the international science community in these questions over the past 10, 15 years. You'll all be aware of certainly most of these initiatives, but particularly in the last 10, 12 years, the emergence of DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which was first released in 2013, and then quite soon after that, the Leiden Manifesto, which was a big statement from the bibliometrics community. I chaired a review for the British government called the Metric Tide, and then there was lots of activity towards the end of the last framework program in anticipation of Horizon Europe to look again at these issues at a European level. And that's just one example of many reports and studies that went on. The focus of much of that work was on bibliometrics, was on measurement and the use and sometimes abuse of bibliometrics in research assessment. And that was really the kind of locus of discussion for the first few years. What we've seen, though, in the last 3, 4, 5 years is a broadening out of that discussion to this wider term responsible research assessment, which is now, of course, I guess the term of art that's being used to talk about these debates in different settings. And there's been lots of activity, again, really driven from Europe particularly, but with a diverse range of actors. And again, there's just a few examples there. The most significant initiative in this space, of course, in the past 2 years has been first the agreement that came first, and then the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment that was launched with the backing of various European institutions. And of course, in a way, I don't need to say much about this to a Spanish audience because certainly from my counting on the COARA website, there are more signatories to COARA in Spain than any other country. There's 800 organizations overall as of this week, the latest data on their website. And about 10% of all of the signatories to COARA are here. So there's quite wide uptake. But COARA, in a sense, builds on all of those initiatives and is now trying to take them to the next level. And I think what, again, as many of you will be aware, what differentiates COARA from things that went before is this commitment to going beyond just signing your name to a statement, as one could do with DORA, but to actually then put in place management systems, tools, frameworks for making this work. So it's an important development. It's still early days. It's still taking shape. There's a lot. It's quite complex. I think most people would acknowledge within it in terms of its governance, and obviously 800 signatories is a large community already to navigate and mobilize in any particular direction. But it's a very important initiative. And of course, it's had a further round of funding from the Commission in recent months. And within it, of course, you've also got national chapters now, including here, and you've got various expert working groups. To take a step back, when we talk about responsible research assessment, what are we sort of bringing into scope when we discuss those debates? This is the definition that we advanced in the working paper you see up there that RoRI published a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, with the Global Research Council, which is the grouping of public research funding agencies. And we said there, RRA is an umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivize, reflect, reward the plural characteristics of high quality research in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. And going on there, while notions of responsible metrics are in a sense most relevant and best applied at the level of indicators themselves, the idea of RRA is to encourage key actors in research systems, funders, research institutions, publishers, and obviously researchers themselves to think about and manage in a more holistic way the methodologies, systems, and cultures of research assessment. So it brings together discussions around measurement and metrics and the sort of agenda that was gathering steam over the last decade around research assessment reform, but combines that with other agendas and imperatives from debates in open scholarship, debates around equality, diversity, and inclusion, and bias we heard about already, and then sort of tries to group them all together under this rather broad and slightly amorphous heading of research culture, which I'll come back to in a bit. So that's sort of what's happening in this space. I wanted to just mention one other report. This is not one of our reports. This is a paper that came out from the International Science Council and the Inter-Academy panel last year. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen it. But it's, I think, a very, very good overview of globally where these debates are at. And one of the nice features of this report is that it includes lots of case studies and examples from outside of Europe and North America, where, who have traditionally, I guess, dominated a lot of these discussions. And we do see, with slightly different terminologies and slightly different contours, similar debates playing out in the Chinese system, in the Indian system, obviously in a number of Latin American contexts. But I'll just mention that they draw 5 key conclusions. I just wanted to pull out the first 3, and I won't read all of this out, but just to draw out the main points that they come to. Firstly, the imperative to rethink the way in which research individuals, institutions' outputs are evaluated is clear and urgent, so this continues to be an important priority for all of the reasons there under that point 1. But secondly, we need to set that challenge in the context of ways in which science itself is changing and evolving. And I think that's a very, very important part of this debate, which brings us into the AI question. Obviously, we have new methods, new tools, the ability to capture, analyze, enormous new data sets in different ways. We also have external pressures on research that have gathered pace and intensity in recent years. The whole drive towards mission-oriented research, the rise of emphasis on transdisciplinarity, all of these agendas which are coming from some from wider society, some from government, some from funders, some from the research community itself, are changing the context in which research assessment systems are developing and evolving. And then thirdly, there's an imperative for balanced research evaluation systems with both quantitative and qualitative indicators that value multiple forms of research output, processes, and activities. And they say also, however, stating that qualitative peer review processes are at least as important as bibliometrics is not straightforward and is further complicated in different parts of the world. And again, I want to come back to this because I think this goes to the heart of how we approach potential uses of AI techniques in this context. So that's the sort of scene, as it were. That's what's happening in research assessment. Basically, it changes country to country, and we could focus in detail on reform debates in any particular system. In the UK, as many of you will know, I'm sure we have a national research framework, assessment framework, now called the REF, which we've had in varying forms since the mid-1980s. And it's evolved partly in response to those external imperatives, and has become very complicated, I would say, as a summary. I mean, it's a sophisticated system, if you want to be charitable. But it continues to spark a lot of discussion, a lot of frustration at times in the UK system, but it's also a very important part of our system. And I think the same is true in certainly in all of those countries that have some kind of national evaluation framework. One thing that differentiates the British model from some countries is that we also link quite a large volume of public funding to the assessment system. And I've been involved in various debates. The most recent study that we did for the UK was a follow-up to the original metric tide report, this thing called Harnessing the Metric Tide, which was published as a contribution to debates about the design of the next REF in the UK. And I want to I won't go into the details of that report because it's too UK specific, but to use it as an example of this broader point, which is that I think we need to avoid the temptation to oversimplify the trade-offs between quantitative and qualitative modes of assessment. And I mean, as I say, I'm very supportive of COARA. I think it's an excellent initiative, and my own institute is a signatory to COARA. If I had one criticism of the text of the agreement that underpins COARA, and I think many in COARA would acknowledge this too, it's that it posits that choice between qualitative and quantitative in a rather binary way. There's a slight element of it reminds me of Animal Farm and sort of pigs and men, but a slight element of quantitative bad, qualitative good, and we recognise that as a response to problems that arose with poor application of conventional bibliometric indicators, which we're all aware of, and that's still a very big problem in science, and it needs to be tackled and resisted in various ways. But to flip hard in the other way and say, well, the solution therefore is to reject the quantitative and instead to elevate the qualitative, I think is overly simplistic. When I did the original metric tide review for the UK government, the headline conclusion that got most attention was that we said to the British government at the time, this was 2015, now is not the time to go for an all-metric assessment system, because to do so would introduce new problems, more problems in a way than the problems you're trying to solve. And so we urged caution in that respect. But most of the study, the report, was a big report that we produced. Most of it was focused on infrastructure for data, because that's actually the solution. If you want to actually get improvements in how we measure and understand research systems, a huge part of that challenge is improving the underpinning data infrastructures, metadata, all of the kind of issues of interoperability between different systems, ideally the move also towards open systems as opposed to proprietary systems. And so, the challenge then is not quant or qual, it's ensuring that the uses of quantitative data are as good as they can be, because we've made the necessary investment. And I think the same kind of points will apply to AI. So again, in this recent study we did, Harnessing the Metric Tide, we said the same thing, that in a way, the point to start with in thinking about the potential redesign of the British system is not with a choice between quant and qual, but rather with a focus first on what are the purposes of this assessment exercise, what are you trying to achieve, and therefore, at what level do you assess? Depending on the level, the potential use of quantitative indicators becomes more helpful. Obviously, if you go right down to the lowest possible level, and then using metrics can be problematic in various ways, as we all know, in terms of assessing, individual outputs or even worse, individual people. But anyway, we need to avoid that oversimplified trade-off, and I think that is an important point to keep re-emphasizing in these debates. A second one is to continue. We heard, I think, from Javier Solano, absolute importance of excellence, and this is which I fully endorse. We're all in favor of excellence, but we also need to recognize that excellence comes in a variety of forms, and that sometimes the word excellence or its equivalents get used as a way of oversimplifying or reducing the analytical lens that we're bringing to research, to research systems in various ways. Indeed, I would say, as a general point of principle, certainly in English, I don't know, words that don't pluralize well are not actually very good words to use in research assessment. So excellence, obviously, excellence doesn't really work, but it's, any word that can't be pluralized is often a bit problematic, because you don't quite know what individuals are smuggling in terms of their prior assumptions as to what lies behind that word. So there's been a lot of debate about this in the funding community over the past few years. I expect we'll hear from our colleague at the ERC, some of the discussions going on there. The ERC, of course, the bastion of excellence as a criteria, but also beginning to not overturn that, but certainly to broaden out what it means by excellence. And by that, I mean, encompassing more than just traditional academic measures of excellence, to include a focus on different forms of societal impact, to focus on a range of different outputs. I don't think that has to come at the expense of traditional forms of excellence. It can complement them. Of course, there are different views on this. The famous British poem by Philip Larkin, Dockery and Son, and he talks about, he goes back to his college and finds that there was a peer of his who's had a child, and he obviously is childless, and he comments to him, this guy, to him, adding meant increase. To me, it means dilution. Well, to me, I think adding does mean increase. We can broaden what we mean by excellence and still protect what's precious in research, but ensure that we're not squeezing out other things. And this is particularly important when we come to think about non-STEM areas of the system. So that third picture there, Reimagining the Recipe, a recent report that I was involved in on the secret source of social science, looking at the ways in which the social sciences contribute to the overall efficiency and running of an R&D system in a whole range of ways, many of which don't necessarily show up in conventional bibliometrics, but are actually very important underpinning sort of system contributions. And it's that kind of thinking that we need to be conscious of as well. Thirdly, in the UK, in Australia, in quite a number of systems that have had a national framework, the broad evolution over the past couple of decades has been starting with an initial focus on productivity and quantity. So when research assessment was first introduced in the UK in the mid-1980s, Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister, was convinced that academics were feckless and lazy and weren't working hard enough. And so they needed a research assessment system to give them a kick up the backside and get them to start producing more work. And that was the initial focus. And we see that often in systems. You saw it over more recent years in, say, in the Chinese system, a big focus on volume and quantity. Eventually, you get to the point in any system where quantity alone is not only not enough, but it's actually quite problematic, because you're emphasizing quantity of outputs at the expense of the quality of those outputs. And of course, then you shift to a focus on quality, which we see in most European systems, and a reduction of the emphasis on quantity. Then the third sort of stage of focus has been introduction of impact, so non-scholarly societal forms of impact, which in our system are now a very important part of the assessment system, as they are in the Netherlands, different way they have been in Australia, a few other systems. Are science, as it were, the measures for impact are far less readily amenable than they are on the conventional output side. We have all the industry of bibliometrics for outputs. When it comes to impacts, we're sort of fishing around still with what tools and measures we have. But we have got more sophisticated metrics on impact. And of course, that's an area where the qualitative, narrative case studies are also very important. And they can be combined with data in various ways. So that's been the sort of thing. And in the UK, that's we've had impact in the system now since the 2014 ref, but since about 2008 in the system. The area now that's generating lots of discussion in a range of systems, including ours, but also several other European countries, is around research culture and environment. So if you're going back to that Venn diagram I showed, it's in an assessment system. If we've been measuring, we're measuring quantity, then we started to measure quality. We started to think about impact. But now, what about the collective research culture, the kind of research environment that people are inhabiting, and the importance of that? And so that is now the area which is generating a lot of discussion. In our system in Britain, there is a proposal from the government, from the funding agencies, to introduce an expanded element of our next research assessment, which won't be until 2029, on people, culture, and environment. There's similar debates, I say, going on in at least half a dozen countries at the moment. There are indicators. We do have some indicators, and there are some indicators we can use for that kind of research environment measurement, but there's also a need to think quite carefully about how we do this and how we do it sensibly. So that's a kind of one of the current frontiers of discussion that I think will continue to be important. And of course, COARA is also very involved and interested in those kinds of questions. Fourth, and sort of turning to application of AI tools and systems to these questions, I think this is a hugely exciting and important area. And as I say, I think, if one was being critical of the movement towards responsible assessment, of which, I've obviously been part, not only can it at times be over simplistic in its bifurcation of quant and qual, but it also can lose sight of one of the other big challenges in this whole space, which is how to do assessment in ways that are less burdensome and less bureaucratic. And we all know that. So the biggest frustration about the REF in the British system isn't the methodology of the exercise, it's the time it takes. It's a lot of effort, even though it's only once every few years. And even though we do get funding as a result of it, it's a huge amount of work. It's a huge industry. I mean, they calculated the costs using a sort of method, a full cost methodology, I'm not sure. And it came up at about £500 million, this last exercise. Of course, that's spread over several years, but still it's a significant cost. And even beyond that, there are other costs, obviously, to any assessment system in terms of what behaviors it incentivizes and rewards it. So for me, one of the most exciting things about AI approaches are that they offer us a potential route through that difficult Gordian knot of bureaucracy and burden. And they also offer us a much more sophisticated path through this trade-off between the reductive risks of some quantitative indicators and the sort of full-blown qualitative approaches of narrative and peer review. And I think when AI approaches to research assessment were first being talked about, the temptation by many was to bracket them with metrics, traditional metrics, as a another reductive frame. This is another way of just simplifying the nuance and richness of what we all do by putting it through an algorithm. I think, as particularly in recent times, as we've seen the emergence of large language models and the potential for these much richer forms of sort of full deep content analysis, that trade-off is much more interesting, much more nuanced. I've done a bit of work. The guy there in the middle is a neuroscientist, neurologist at UCL called Parashkev Nachev, who does amazing work, on very sophisticated AI models to understand the human brain. And one day, he and his colleagues sort of took the methods that they've been developing in that context and decided to use them in a predictive way to look at the potential impacts of biomedical research papers. And they published a paper that you can see there in Patents that came out in 2022. Very interesting. This is a guy, he's not a research policy person, but as is often the case, kind of turning his hand to this because, they can see the application of the methods. And spending time talking, learning, looking at what they're doing, it really brought home to me the error of categorizing this as reductive, in that they, that Parashkev and many of those working in AI would argue quite the opposite, that what they're doing is the absolute opposite of reductive. So this is a challenge. I think it's a real challenge for how we think about the place of AI approaches in this reform agenda. I would strongly urge keeping the AI conversation in the mix with the COARA conversation. I think it would be very unfortunate if these now branched off and you had a sort of pro-AI conversation here and a sort of pro-responsible assessment conversation there, because I think, as I'm trying to say, and we'll hear more, I'm sure, from other speakers about this, I think there is a way of squaring that circle, but it needs to be approached with great care. And we don't, what we mustn't do is, leap to apply these models without having properly understood how well they work across entire systems. They may work brilliantly in analysis of biomedical research, but when we try and then look at the humanities, they're absolutely useless. And that's a common feature as well, obviously, in our use of bibliometrics. So we need to be cautious, but I think open-minded. And that links to my final and sort of broader point, which is that I think in research assessment, in research funding overall, this discussion needs to also be situated as part of a broader move to be more experimental and more evidence-informed in how we run and evaluate, operate the research system. And this is really the whole agenda of meta-science, research on research, science of science, call it what you want, that RoRI is part of, and there are many other initiatives all over the world now engaged in this broad endeavor, which is to try and, as we turn the tools of research back on the research system itself to improve the way we run, operate, evaluate research. So it's a very, very important and exciting area at the moment. It's not new. There's people worked in it for a while, but there's a lot more energy and again, just so many more methodological possibilities. Again, many coming from AI related tools and techniques. So I won't say much more than that. There's a couple of examples there of things we're doing. The Experimental Research Funders Handbook, RoRI published a year or so ago, which was designed really as a manual for research funders who want to get more experimental in their approaches. But the other thing I've mentioned at the bottom there is the Agora project we run, which is a global observatory of responsible research assessment. And that links to the other point in my sentence there at the top, that we need to also get better at learning more systematically from attempts at research assessment reform elsewhere, which we're not normally certainly in Britain, I think the case in many systems, you tend to sort of run your evaluation cycle and then you might poke your head up and look around at what others are doing, and then you get back down and get on with your own national framework. And I think that's not really sufficient, because there's so much going on in this space and there's so many things being tried out by different funders, by different governments, by different evaluation agencies. It's really important that we improve those flows. COARA can do part of that, and the working groups will do part of it, but there's there are other more I suppose empirically robust ways of doing it as well. So those would be my main points. I hope that's helpful as a contribution. I look forward very much to the discussion, and thank you again for the chance to be with you. Thank you.